If you've ever been to Singapore, you will know what a hawker center is. They're this big, open-air food courts filled with rows of stalls, each one cooking something different. You know, the usual chicken rice, laksa, or satay. They're a very noisy place, crowded and full of life. It's where family goes for dinner, and students grab a quick lunch, or where uncles and aunties sit for kopi in the morning. But hawker centers don't stay open all night. By the evening, most of the stalls are closed. The lights are off and the chairs are stacked. The place is quiet. Some centers have a few late night shops, but most of the time, by midnight, they are completely empty. That's why this story that I'm going to tell you is so strange. Because one man swears that after a night out, when he was so tired, hungry, and just looking for something hot to eat, he found a hawker center that should have not been open. The lights were on, the stalls were still serving, and people were sitting at the tables. But the problem is, it was already 3 in the morning, and that's the hour that people here call it the ghost hour. Jason Lim was 28 years old. He worked a normal office job in the city, the kind where most days felt the same. Filled with meetings, deadlines, and rushing for the MRT and answering emails. He wasn't a really superstitious person. He didn't believe in ghost stories. To him, life was simple. Work hard during the week and enjoy himself on the weekends. And that Friday night, he had gone out with a few colleagues. They started with drinks after work, then moved on to a club near Clark Way. The music was loud, and the bass shook the floor, and the lights flashed until it felt like morning never came. For a few hours, Jason forgot about work, forgot about his tired body, and just enjoyed himself. By the time he stumbled out of the club, it was already past 3 in the morning. The music still rang in his ears, and the heavy beat echoing inside his head even though he was standing outside now. The street smelled of cigarettes, cheap beer, and fried food from the vendors who had already packed up for the night. His shirt was damp with sweat, sticking to his skin, and the humid air made him feel sticky all over. Most of his friends had already gone home earlier. They had waved for taxis and disappeared into the night, leaving Jason all alone. He told himself he would go home soon too. But first, he wanted some food. After hours of drinking and dancing, it had left him starving. He didn't really want fast food. He didn't want chips or instant noodles. What he wanted was a proper meal. A hot, steaming bowl of noodles. Something feel real to fill his stomach before he went to bed. He started walking slowly on the road, and the city felt so different now compared to the few hours ago. The streets were quiet, most of the shops were already dark. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer, casting long, stretched shadows across the empty pavement. A taxi or two drove past him from time to time, but otherwise, the place felt still, almost too quiet for a city like Singapore. And then, Jason saw it. At the end of a narrow alley, there was a faint glow. A neon sign, flickering in the darkness, buzzing softly like an old electric wire. The sign looked worn. Half of the letters were already missing, but he could still read it, and the sign said, Hawker Center. Jason frowned. He knew this area well. There was not supposed to be a hawker center here. Jason stood at the mouth of the alley, staring at the faint glow in the distance. The neon sign buzzed softly, and its pale light spilling across the old concrete walls. And for a moment, he wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He had walked this area before, and he was certain there was not supposed to be a hawker center here. Still, the light pulled him forward. The alley was narrow, lined with dark buildings whose shutters were pulled down for the night. His footsteps echo against the walls, sounding louder than they should have been in the quiet, and the further he walked, the heavier the air seems to feel. Halfway through, he noticed a stray dog crouched near a trash bin. Its head was low and its fur matted, and when Jason stepped closer, The dog suddenly raised its head and let out a low growl. Its eyes locked onto him, unblinking, and the sound made his skin prickle. As he continued forward, the dog didn't follow. Instead, it backed away slowly, disappearing into the shadows with a faint whimper, almost as if it was warning him to turn back. Jason gave a nervous laugh to himself, shaking his head. It was just a stray dog, nothing more. Maybe it was hungry, maybe it's just scared, but as he kept walking, he couldn't shake the strange feeling in the air. It smelled faintly of smoke, mixed with sharp, sweet scent of incense, as if someone had been burning offerings nearby. The closer he came to the end of the alleyway, the more the sign flickered. It wasn't steady like a normal neon sign, but instead, it pulsed in and out almost like a heartbeat, and Jason's chest tightened as he stepped forward. And then, suddenly, the alleyway opened to a wider space, and there it was, the hawker center. Bright, alive, glowing with light. The tables were neatly arranged, and the stalls opened for business. He could see the steam curling up from pots and pans, as if people had just started cooking. From a distance, it looked like any other hawker center in Singapore. But something in his stomach twisted. At 3 in the morning, no hawker center should be open. As Jason stepped closer, he realized how strangely alive the hawker center looked. The lights above flickered and hummed, bathing the rows of tables in a pale, cold glow. Several stalls were open, their counters covered with steaming bowls and pots of broth bubbling, and the pans clanging faintly as if someone was still cooking behind them. What surprised him the most was that there were people sitting at the table. From where he stood, it looked like the place still had customers. Men and women sat hunched over their food, with chopsticks in their hand, slowly moving up and down. Some had their heads bowed down so low that their faces were completely hidden, while others just sat in silence, frozen in mid-bite. At first, Jason felt relief. Maybe he wasn't imagining things after all. Maybe this was one of those late-night centers that he had never noticed before, one that stayed open until morning for people like him who stumble out of the clubs hungry. His stomach growled, and for a moment he thought of how good a hot meal would taste. But then, as he walked a little bit deeper inside, he noticed something that made his relief fade. This place was too quiet. A hawker center was usually filled with noise, voices calling out orders, the sound of the stall owners shouting, and the clatter of trays and plates, people talking over each other. But there was none of that. The only sounds were the faint scrap of chopsticks and the soft clink of metal spoons tapping against the bowls. Nobody was laughing, and nobody was chatting with a friend. Not even a whisper carried across the air. The silence pressed down on him, and the longer he listened, the more unnatural it felt. As Jason passed one table, his eyes caught something that made him stop. A man was sitting perfectly still, his chopsticks moving up and down, but his bowl was empty. There was nothing inside, no noodles, no soup, nothing at all. But yet the man continued to lift the chopsticks to his mouth, again and again, like he was eating something invincible. Jason swallowed hard and looked away quickly. His throat felt dry, and though his body screamed at him to leave, his hunger pulled him forward. He told himself he was imagining things, that maybe the man had just finished his meal and was fiddling with his chopsticks. He didn't really want to think much about it. He just wanted to get some food. So he kept walking, his footsteps echoing strangely under the lights and deeper into the hawker center that shouldn't have been open at all. As Jason walked further inside, the sound of his own footsteps echoing faintly against the tiled floor. The hawker center looked full, yet it felt completely lifeless. He kept glancing around, expecting to hear people calling out an order, or the clank of a pan being tossed at the back, or at least a little chatter between the diners. But all that he heard was the steady scram of chopsticks and the occasional clink of a spoon tapping against the bowl. So he slowed down, looking more closely at the people sitting at the tables. Something about the way they move unsettled him. Their motions were stiff, almost mechanical, as if they were following a rhythm that wasn't quite normal. A woman lifted her spoon to her mouth, but never seems to chew. She just held it there for a long moment before lowering it again. And a man hunched low over his bowl, his back completely still. His head never turned. It was as if they were locked in his own little world, repeating the same gesture again and again. Jason glanced over another table and felt his stomach twisted. A middle-aged man sat with his chopstick raised but frozen mid-air. His hand trembled slightly, but his face was tilted down, completely hidden in the shadow of its hair. The chopsticks never reached his mouth. They just hovered there, as if he had forgotten what to do next. Jason quickly looked away, but in the corner of his eye, he caught sight of another diner. This one was not even eating. There was a young woman who sat completely still, with both hands resting on the table, her eyes staring straight down at her empty bowl. Her chest didn't rise, and her shoulders didn't move, and yet, somehow, she looked as though she had been sitting there for hours. The silence pressed down on him heavier now, so heavy that it felt wrong. A hawker center was never supposed to be this quiet. Even in the middle of the night, there would always be a laughter, chatter, or the sizzle of food cooking. But here, there was none of it. Only the airy, steady scram of chopsticks moving in bowls that didn't seem to have food in them. Jason's stomach clenched, this time not just from hunger, but from something else. A sharp, uneasy feeling crawled up his spine. Something about this place was deeply and painfully wrong. But even then, against all reason, he kept moving forward. He told himself maybe he was just tired. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. Maybe the alcohol was messing with his head. He only needed a hot meal, just one bowl of noodles before going home. And with that thought in mind, Jason walked deeper into the hawker center, pretending not to notice that none of the diners had spoken a single word since he arrived. Jason finally stopped in front of one of the stalls. From a distance, it looked normal enough, with pots and pans laid out neatly, steam curling up in the air, and the faint smell of broth drifting out. For a moment, he felt a sense of relief. Maybe he had just been imagining things. Maybe the stall was real. The person behind the counter stood quietly, almost too quiet. Jason couldn't see the vendor's face clearly because of the way that the shadow fell across it, but he could make out the figure. Thin shoulders, hand resting on the counter and standing very still as if waiting. "Can I get a bowl of noodle, please?" Jason asked, his voice sounding louder than he expected in the silence of the hawker center. The vendor didn't say a word. There was no friendly nod, no casual reply like he used to do. Instead, the figure simply dipped their head once, slowly, and then turned towards the stove. Jason shifted awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck as he waited. He tried to glance around, but the other diners hadn't moved. Every head was still bent over the tables, every hand repeating the same stiff motions. He looked back at the stall, trying to focus on the cooking instead. The vendor worked quickly, their hands moving in a blur, but something about the way that they moved made Jason feel uneasy. The skin on their hands looked strange, thin, almost gray, like paper stretched too tight over bones. He swallowed hard and told himself he was imagining it. Maybe the lights made the skin look that way. As the pot of the broth bumbled loudly, and as Jason listened, he thought he heard something else beneath the bumbling. At first, it sounded like a hiss, but as he leaned in a little closer, he realized it sounded almost like voices. Faint whispers, too soft to make out clearly, as if many people were speaking all at once inside the boiling broth. Jason stepped back quickly, blinking hard. He laughed nervously under his breath. He was just drunk, he told himself. That's all. He was tired, tipsy, and hungry. His mind was just playing tricks on him. Steam curled upward as the vendor lifted the noodles from the pot and placed them inside a bowl. The movements were smooth and practiced, and the silence never broke. Not a single word was spoken during the entire time. Jason felt his chest tighten as the bowl was placed in front of him, and the hot steam rising up into his face. The vendor stepped back, their head tilted down, waiting. Jason stared at the bowl, and for a moment, he thought the smell was too strong, rich, heavy, almost metallic. But then his stomach growled up again, louder this time, and hunger pushed all of his doubts away. He sat down, picked up the chopsticks, and told himself it was just food, just a normal bowl of noodles, nothing more. Jason sat at one of the plastic tables, with the steaming bowl in front of him, and for a moment, he felt almost normal again. The noodles looked real enough, and the broth was hot, and the rising steam warmed his face. After hours of drinking and dancing, the sight of food was almost comforting. He picked up the chopsticks and stirred the noodle around. The broth gave off a smell that was strong, heavier than expected. It wasn't like the usual clear, simple soup he was used to. This one smelled richer, thicker, almost metallic, with a faint sharpness that he couldn't place. But his hunger was stronger than his doubt. He lifted the noodles to his mouth and took the first bite. The taste surprised him. It wasn't bad actually. It was good, maybe even too good. The flavors were deep and heavy, filling his mouth in a way that felt overwhelming. He slurped up quickly, finishing one bite and then another until his hunger began to ease. But as he ate, something felt off. He looked around and noticed that none of the other diners had moved since he sat down. Their heads were still bent low. Their hands were still repeating the same motions. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint scrap of chopsticks on the bowl. No chewing, no swallowing, just the sound of movements without meaning. Jason forced himself to focus on his food. He lifted another spoonful of broth, bringing it closer to his mouth. But this time, as the liquid touched his tongue, he froze. The flavor was strong, almost too strong, with a sharpness that reminded him of blood. His stomach turned slightly, but he swallowed anyway, telling himself he was just imagining things. He looked up again. His eyes met something that made his skin crawl. Across the room, one of the diners had stopped moving. A man sat completely still, his face tilted just enough for Jason to see his eyes. They were open too wide, staring directly at him across the table, with no expression, no blink, just that empty stare. Jason quickly dropped his gaze back to his bowl. His heart was beating faster now, but his chopstick stood as he forced himself to eat another bite. He told himself he was just tired, just drunk, that the man wasn't really looking at him. But then he risked another glance again. The diner's head was back down, chopsticks moving stiffly like nothing had happened. Jason pressed his lips together, forcing down the last of the bite. The hunger that had driven him here was fading, replacing by the rising sense of dread. But still, he kept completely still because he didn't know what else to do. Jason leaned back in his chair and set the chopstick down for a moment. His stomach was no longer growling, and he didn't feel satisfied either. The heavy taste of the broth still clung to his tongue, and there was a strange weight in his chest, like the food wasn't sitting right. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear his head. Maybe it was just the alcohol, or maybe he was just too tired. But something about this place was starting to feel more and more wrong. The silence was getting to him. No matter how much he tried to focus on the meal, he couldn't ignore the way the diners around him kept moving in those slow, stiff motions without ever making a sound. His eyes wandered back towards the noodle stall where he had ordered his food. The vendor was still standing there, head lowered, body completely still, almost like a statue waiting for something. Behind the vendor was a large glass panel, the kind many stalls used to display menus or to keep the utensils stacked neatly. But this one was different. It reflected everything in front of the stall like a mirror. For a moment, Jason felt a small sense of relief. A reflection was normal. Reflections were safe. He leaned forward slightly and looked at it more closely, hoping to distract himself from the uneasy feeling in his stomach. That's when he noticed it. In the reflection, he could see himself sitting at the table, bowl of noodles in front of him. That was much normal. But when he looked beyond himself, his blood ran cold. The rows of tables behind him were empty, completely empty. Not a single diner was sitting there. No hunched shoulders, no bowed heads, and no moving chopsticks. Just rows and rows of bare tables under the flickering lights, as reflected in the mirror. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He turned his head quickly, eyes darting back to the real room behind him. Every single table was still full. The diner was still there, sitting motionless, hands moving slowly and heads bent low. His heart began to pound in his ears. He looked back at the reflection. Empty. And he turned his head again to look at everyone, and the hawker center was full. He blinked hard, telling himself it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, or maybe the angle of the mirror was wrong. But no matter how many times he looked, the reflection never matched what was really there. Jason gripped at the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He could feel sweat sliding down the back of his neck, even though the air around him was cold. He wanted to get up, to leave, but his legs felt heavy, almost rooted to the ground. For the first time since he walked in, Jason thought, I should not be here. Jason finally pushed the bowl away. His hunger was gone, replaced by a heavy knot in his stomach and a rising sense of unease that he could no longer ignore. The broth still clung to his lips, thick and metallic, and every time he swallowed, he thought he could still taste it. He wanted nothing more than just to leave. He reached for his wallet, fumbling slightly with his fingers. It was a small, ordinary action, and for a moment, it grounded him. If he just paid and left, he told himself, everything would be fine. He walked out and called a taxi and laughed about this strange night tomorrow. But when he placed a few notes on the table, the vendor didn't move. The figure behind the counter stood there in complete silence, head still lowered and hands folded neatly in front of them, as if they hadn't seen the money at all. Jason frowned. He lifted the notes and stepped closer and held them out. That was when the vendor finally reacted. Slowly, very slowly, the figure raised one hand and pushed the money back toward him. Then, without a single word, the vendor slid something else across the counter. A single coin. Jason stared at it. The coin was small, dark, and strangely heavy-looking, its surface tarnished and worn as if it had been handled thousands of times. He picked it up and felt an icy chill run across his palm. It didn't feel like any coin that he had ever used in Singapore. It felt old, too old, like it belonged to another time entirely. His throat tightened as he looked up, and for the first time that night, the vendor spoke. The voice was dry, raspy, and almost like dead leaves scraping against each other in the wind. It's already paid, the vendor said. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He turned around quickly and desperate to break away from the vendor's empty gaze, and that was when he noticed them. The diners. Every single one of them had stopped moving, chopsticks frozen mid-air, spoons hovering above bowls and heads still bent, but their eyes, one by one, were lifting, slowly turning, all of them fixing their gaze directly on him. Jason's breath caught in his chest. The silence in the room grew heavier, thicker and pressing down on him until he felt like he couldn't breathe. He tried to move, but his legs felt weak. All he could do was stand there, clutching the coin in his shaking hand. And as thousands of unblinking eyes stared at him across the tables, Jason's breath came in shallow bursts as he stood frozen in place, the heavy coin still clenched in his sweaty palm. The silence in the hawker center felt unbearable now. So thick it pressed against his chest like a weight. He forced himself to lift his eyes just a little, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Every single diner in the room had turned toward him. Dozens of faces, pale and hollow, all staring at him all at once. Some of them still had their chopstick in the air, frozen mid-motion. A few had spoons lifted, the broth dripping into their bowls slowly, but none of them moved. None of them blinked. They just sat there, twisted in unnatural poses, but all eyes were fixed on him. Jason wanted to speak, to say something, even just a nervous little laughter to break the silence, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy, and his voice was gone. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest, he thought it might give him away, like a prey trapped under the gaze of the predators. He forced himself to look at their faces more closely, and the longer he looked, the more wrong they became. Some mouths hung slightly open, revealing teeth too dark and too sharp. Some eyes were sunk into the deep gray sockets. One face looked thin and stretched, as if the skin had been pulled too tightly over the bones, while another looked bloated, as if it had been left underwater for days. But the worst part was that none of them spoke, not a single word, not a whisper, just the sound of the lights buzzing overhead and the faint drip of the broth falling back into the bowls. Jason's hand trembled around the coin. He wanted to drop it, but his fingers wouldn't unclutch. The metal felt colder now, almost biting into his skin. His legs felt stiff, but deep inside, every part of his body screamed at him to run. He took a small step backward, his chair scrambling against the wall. The sound echoed through the hawker center, sharp and jarring, but none of the diners flinched. They didn't move at all. They just kept watching. Another step, another scramble of his shoes. Still, no one moved, but their eyes followed him. All of them. He could feel their gaze growling across his skin as he edged slowly toward the exit. By the time he reached the doorway, Jason's chest felt so tight he thought he might faint. The coin burned cold in his hand. He didn't dare to look back. He just turned and bolted out into the night. Jason buzzed through the doorway, his shoes slamming against the wet ground as he stumbled into the night air, his chest heavied and his breath coming in sharp grabs that echoed too loudly in the narrow alley. For a moment, he thought he could still feel their eyes on his back, the weight of dozens of stairs following him even as he ran. He didn't stop until he was midway down the alley. Only then did he dare to glance behind him, and his stomach dropped. The hawker center was gone. Where the bright lights and steaming stalls had been only a moment ago, there was nothing now. Nothing at all besides an empty lot. The space was dark, abandoned, and broken down. The concrete was cracked. Weeds pushed through the gap and rusted beams leaned dangerously against each other like forgotten bones of a building that had long collapsed. The neon sign was gone too. No glow, no buzzing hum, just shadows. Jason staggered backward, his hand pressed against the wall to steady himself. He blinked hard, convinced he must have been drunk, or maybe he had imagined it all, but the smell of the broth still clung to his lips, heavy and metallic. And when he opened his palm, the coin was still there. It lay in the center of his hand, cold and solid, pressing into his skin. In the dim light of the alley, he could finally see it more clearly. The coin was old, far too old, its edges uneven and its surface dark and tarnished. Strange markings covered it, characters he didn't recognize, faint and worn down by time. His fingers shook as he held it up. A wave of nostalgia rose in his throat. It wasn't just a coin that someone used anymore. It didn't belong to the present. It belonged somewhere else. Jason's legs felt weak, but he forced himself to keep walking. He didn't look back again. He just kept moving out of the alleyway towards the main road, desperate to find a taxi, desperate to find something else that is normal again. Even then, as he stumbled forward under the street lamps, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hawker center hadn't really disappeared. It was still there, waiting in the shadow, hidden from the living eye, and he had sat at one of the tables when he had not supposed to. The coin dug into his palm, colder than ever. He couldn't let it go. The next morning, Jason woke up in his own bed, but his sleep had been restless. He dreamt of the lights and the sound of chopsticks and the heavy weight of the coin still pressed into his palm. When he opened his eyes, the coin was lying on his bedside table, dark and cold as ever. He didn't know why, but the first person that he thought of was his grandmother. She had always been the one to remind him of old customs, little superstitions and things he used to laugh at when he was younger. But now, after what he had seen, he was not laughing anymore. When he told her about what happened last night, her face grew pale. She didn't interrupt, didn't tell him he was imagining things. She just listened quietly with her lips pressed tightly together. When he finished, she stood without a word and went to the kitchen. Jason watched as she pulled out a pocket of salt and a small bundle of leaves tied with string. She boiled the leaves in a pot of water until the steam filled the room with a sharp citrus smell. Then she poured the hot water into a basin and told Jason to wash his face, his arms, and the back of his neck with it. "This will wash away the dirt," she said softly. Her voice was low, the kind of dirt that you cannot see. After that, she took a handful of salt, sprinkled it across the doorway of the house. The grains scattered against the floor, a simple barrier, but her movements were firm and practiced, as though she had done this many times before. Finally, she placed a small stick of incense into Jason's hand and lit it for him. "Bow 3 times, she instructed, "and tell them to not follow you. Tell them they must go back." Jason did as she said. He bowed, and the smoke curling up into the air, carrying his words with it. When the incense was nearly burned out, the grandmother took the coin from him and placed it inside a folded piece of yellow paper. And without hesitation, she lit it and watched until the fire consumed it completely. Only then she finally did speak again. "You were lucky," she whispered. "You left before they could finish the meal." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't ask what she meant. And that was Jason's story. A hawker center that should not have been opened at midnight or at 3 in the morning. Diners that should have not been eating, and a seat that was never meant for the living. What do you think? Do places like this really exist? Hidden in plain sight, only opening at the ghost hour. And if you were Jason, for example, would you sit down and eat at the hawker center?